Okay, so party or voting, elections, campaigns, we've talked a little bit about parties and interest groups, and parties obviously more directly involved in campaigns and interest groups, but both involved. Now, the specifics of voting, elections, election campaigns, okay, the kind of sustained, organized, coordinated effort to win an election, okay, voting, looking at all this, okay, in this unit or this chapter, okay. So let's start with the primary system, okay, and especially presidential primaries, okay. So every election has a primary as well as a general election. The general election decides who will actually take the office, okay. So the general election is usually and it's a little bit complicated, but basically it's the first Tuesday in November after the first Monday, so it will never be November 1st. So the primary election is the election leading up to that, where it's usually internal to a party, and the party decides who their nominee will be for the general election, okay? And we'll look especially here at the presidential primaries, because of course they get the most attention for all kinds of reasons. And in theory, every election has a primary. Sometimes a person may run unopposed, especially if they're a very popular incumbent or if they're in an area where one party is far more dominant, okay? But the nomination is the official endorsement of a candidate for political office by a political party, okay? When we're talking about the presidency, that usually happens at a national party convention, which happens every 4 years. Delegates from all around the country who are members of that party get together, at least for the Democrats and the Republicans. Smaller third parties may have conventions, but they may be somewhat smaller and different. But the two major parties, they get together. The delegates, they write a platform, which is not binding. When they get into office, they may do something different, but it's a statement of principles. And at least in theory, that might be part of what people are basing their allegiance to a particular party on, okay? In 2020, the Republican Party did not write a platform, just said, we'll do whatever Donald Trump says, we just support Donald Trump. But that's very rare. Usually they get together, and it's usually a fairly systematic and detailed platform that says their opinion and their preferences on all sorts of policy issues, okay? And again, it doesn't mean that if they get into office, first of all, that they will be able to do all of those things. And secondly, even if they even if they are able to do all those things, even if they have a majority in both houses of Congress and the president, even if all that belongs to one party at a given time, it doesn't mean that the party will carry out their platform exactly for all kinds of reasons, right? But it's still somewhat significant. Still an important statement of principles and ideals and so on, okay? Getting to that point, okay, and the National Party Convention used to be somewhat more dynamic and uncertain. It used to be that maybe you would go to the party convention and not know who the nominee would be, and sometimes there would be multiple rounds of voting among the delegates. Sometimes deals were made in back rooms to decide who would actually be the nominee for president. And of course, that was that period when we talked about the imperial presidency, remember, we talked about how the political parties were stronger in the 19th century, a little bit into the 20th century, and how the president and presidential candidates as individuals became more powerful in the 20th century, and how that kind of led to some of the conditions for the imperial presidency to emerge. So the party conventions used to be really important for actually deciding the president. Now the president has usually, the nominee, party conventions used to be important for deciding the nominee for the party, not the president. That's, again, the general election. But they used to be very important for deciding the party's nominee. Now it's almost always known ahead of time because it's decided by the primaries. And the other thing is that, now they're not necessarily sterile, but they're almost like an extended infomercial for the party. Usually you have well-known figures, maybe former presidents, popular figures in the party, and sometimes rising stars. That's sort of Bill Clinton. That's where he first got on the national stage. Barack Obama especially gave a very dynamic and compelling speech at the 2004 Democratic Convention, and that's when people started to say, hey, who is this guy? Maybe he has some kind of a future. And of course, 4 years later, he was elected president. So not that that always happens, not that everybody who gives a good speech at a convention gets elected president next time, but there are definitely some rising stars that can be important in that way, okay? The other thing to understand about the primary system is you have two types of elections, okay? You have primary elections, which are just like normal elections where you just go and cast a ballot. And then you also have a caucus. And a caucus is like a meeting of party members where you're supposed to debate and talk about which candidate you support and for what reason. And then sometimes you'll actually go and stand in different areas and caucus, and that way group with a different, with a particular candidate. And then after the first round, they might debate a little bit more and people may change their vote basically and say, okay, I was caucusing alone, or three of us were caucusing with this candidate or for this candidate. We'll move over here now, or I'm going to move over here and these two are going to move over there. So the caucus is it's a different system. It's obviously supposed to be more democratic. There's more actual discussion. There's more debate back and forth. Again, people can change their mind, maybe because their candidate isn't really doing anything, but ideally through the power of persuasion and political reasoning and practical reason and so on. It's supposed to be more democratic. It's been a little bit more contentious in recent years, and some people have found that it can be too confrontational, or people are worried about that. The other thing is it takes more time. So in some ways it suppresses voter turnout, because if you need, if you don't know how long this meeting will last and you're not sure about all of these things, you might need to take more time. So caucus turnout tends to be very low. Primary turnout is fairly low generally, as we'll talk about. Caucus turnout tends to be even lower because it does take a little bit more time, okay? But there are those two different systems, or those two different methods for voting or deciding on these votes. They both, when we're talking about the primary system, we're talking about both, okay? So the first primary, we'll talk about this, is the Iowa primary for both parties every 4 years. It's actually a caucus, but again, it's part of that process. It counts. It's worth understanding that there's this difference, what it is, why it can be important in some situations, but it's also just part of what we call the primary process. So we don't need to worry too much about that when we're talking about primaries. We are also talking about caucuses. Most states have a primary, just a simple ballot that you walk in, vote on. Maybe you have to wait in line, but you walk in, you cast your ballot and you leave. Iowa, other states have a caucus, okay? And things change after, especially the 1968 convention in Chicago for the Democrats, okay? There's a real kind of generational clash among the Democrats. There are older Democrats who ultimately side with the eventual nominee, Hubert Humphrey, who are somewhat liberal domestically and in terms of social policy and economic policy, and certainly support civil rights and so on, but they're somewhat more hawkish when it comes to foreign policy. And they see the Soviet Union and communism generally as a threat. Don't necessarily support the Vietnam War completely or think that that was a good idea or prudent, but they are not necessarily as radical or as peace-loving, not really leftist, but sort of there's another, the younger generation, much more anti-war, and there's real conflict. And part of this is there's violence, riots with the Chicago, not really riots, but there's some violence with the Chicago police clearing away the protesters, okay? And it gets a lot of attention, right? These national conventions, again, they get attention. Television is in full swing by now. People are watching this on their television. It is not the image that the Democratic Party wants to convey to the nation, okay? So after that, they form a commission called the McGovern-Fraser Commission, after the people heading it, to look into, well, what's wrong? What are people upset about? How can we fix this? The protesters at the convention, women who were members of the Democratic Party, minorities, they wanted a fair and more transparent process. They felt like senior party members had too much power and made too many important decisions effectively in secret, or at least out of the public eye, okay? So the simplest way to fix that was to switch to a primary system, right? Rather than things being decided at the convention and decided even somewhat, in private by party leaders in a way that people don't fully know about or understand why this decision was made or have any input or influence over it. These elections, which they had primary elections already, but they were treated as more advisory. It's like, okay, here's what the voters think. However, at the convention, the party leaders, the senior party members may need to make different decisions, okay? That's the way it was done, and they switched over to where, okay, now the primary elections will set up a system, will apportion delegates to each state, depending on the population of the state and so on, or maybe the number of registered voters of our party in that state. And whoever wins the most delegates wins the nomination. We'll do it that way. The Democrats for a while had people called super delegates, And those were people who basically had influence or control over other delegates. So they were one person, but they were responsible for 30, say, votes, 30 delegates altogether. They got rid of that after 2016, very controversial. Most of the superdelegates backed Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders. It wasn't nearly as dramatic, but there was a bit of a replay of that in 2016, where you had younger, more kind of outside people who wanted the nomination process to be very different, felt like they were not being represented in the party that wanted their votes, but wasn't really representing them, wasn't really taking into account what they wanted and what they thought was important. Same thing happened in 1968, more dramatic fashion. They switched to the primary system. Democrats got rid of superdelegates after 2016 because of that criticism, okay? Republicans never really had superdelegates, but nominees are now rarely chosen at the convention. They're usually based on whoever wins the most delegates through the primary process, but the primary process itself has certain issues, okay? Primary cycle, Iowa, New Hampshire, we just said Iowa is technically a caucus, but those first two states get a lot of attention. And sometimes people will drop out after the first, if they don't do as well as they expected in Iowa or in Iowa and New Hampshire, they may drop out after that. So we'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more. It was once considered advantageous to have a later primary. It was considered better because the idea was, okay, at the beginning, it's a very crowded field. A lot of these people probably aren't going to be serious contenders. So if you have a somewhat later primary, that's better because the less, by then you kind of narrowed it down to the real contenders, the 2, 3, maybe 4 people who really have a shot at the nomination, and then you can help decide that later on. Now, and the aughts maybe represented the high point of this. Of people dropping out after, even sometimes before a primary, okay? There was a guy named Tim Pawlenty, who was a Republican governor of Minnesota, who a lot of people thought would be a great Republican candidate for president, and he dropped out before even the Iowa primary because he did not poll very well in a straw poll. So some of the anticipation and the hype and whatnot surrounding these primaries, sometimes people just drop out after that, okay? So, by the time you get to those just a little bit later, there may just be one candidate. So you're not helping to decide who the nominee will be. It's already been decided, maybe after 2 or 3 primary elections. Recently, again, not so much. 2016, Bernie Sanders went all the way. Ted Cruz didn't go all the way, but there were multiple people in a little bit later. 2020, again, happened somewhat quickly, but again, certainly you had multiple serious contenders beyond New Hampshire, right? So some of those things of it ending very quickly after that, not so much recently, but still a thing, okay? When we come to criticisms of this primary cycle that we have, it is often very long. They've tried to push it back a little bit. There was a bit there where, the Iowa caucus, I think, was in the end of January. They've tried to push it back a little bit, okay, but it's still not entirely there. Okay, this is called front loading, this tendency to try to have your primary earlier and earlier in the calendar in order to capitalize on media attention. Get more attention for your state, maybe just for your sense of importance. Okay, front loading makes the primary process longer, and there's also, for different reasons, makes people think that initial primary is very important, okay? In 1980, George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, won an early primary. I think it might have been New Hampshire, and he said he had big mo, meaning momentum. And again, this is an interesting thing where traditionally you would say momentum doesn't necessarily matter. It's organization, it's fundraising. It's, you might win an early primary and that happens. Somebody wins an early primary or they do much better than expected, but they can't really sustain that success because again, they don't have the organization, they don't have the funding, they don't have whatever. Not quite as true recently. Joe Biden in particular won the nomination in 2020 despite having relatively little organization. Had a lot of name recognition, obviously, because he had been Barack Obama's vice president, but did not have the organization or the funding. Some of the other candidates did, but he was able to carry through and win. Donald Trump had relatively little organization compared to some of these other candidates, spent relatively little money compared to some of them in 2016 and was successful. Again, Bernie Sanders made it, went through the entire primary cycle in 2016. So this idea that people just disappear after the first few races, and that organization and fundraising is everything, not as true in the past couple of presidential elections as it has been traditionally. Um, Likewise, there is what is called the invisible primary, okay? The invisible primary, the idea there is that party leaders, big donors maybe, but especially kind of senior party people, through endorsements and things like that, help to direct the voters to particular candidates. So you have the actual visible primary, the elections, the voting and everything, but you have what is sometimes called the invisible primary. Sometimes the phrase is the party decides, meaning party leaders, through endorsements and things like that, clearly direct voters, if not exactly who to pick, at least who not to pick, or they direct them towards 2 or 3 options, okay? And again, 2016, that went out the window. It's Donald Trump has so much influence over the Republicans now, it's hard to remember that he was not very popular, especially with party leaders when he first started running in 2016. He didn't get any of the major endorsements, and he didn't necessarily have access to the same major donors that some of the other candidates did. So the invisible primary and the notion that the party decides, you know, people like Mitt Romney and George W. Bush, kind of party elders, that they would basically unofficially decide through endorsements and things like that. That didn't happen at all in 2016. Again, 2016, Bernie Sanders did better than you would have expected based on the invisible primary, right? The invisible primary, nobody was endorsing Bernie Sanders. He did pretty well in the primary, at least compared to that. 2020, again, Biden ends up winning. That looks a bit more like the return of the party really deciding and really having that influence. The invisible primary becoming more important. So there is that concept of the invisible primary, maybe not quite as decisive, certainly in 2016. 2020, maybe a bit of a return to that. We will see in the future, okay? Criticisms of this long primary campaign, okay? Again, if you're talking about the primary beginning in January or even in February, the thing is the media anticipation and everything, the fundraising, the traveling, all of these things begin the year before, sometimes maybe even 2 years before the actual general election, okay? If the general election is in November 2020, a lot of people might start declaring their candidacy the summer before, summer 2019. So well over a year before that happens, they're traveling, they're fundraising, okay? And they might have really begun their campaign and their fundraising and some of the other things that they're doing to begin to get support. They have begun that even, in November of the previous year, even earlier, right? So you have a very long primary campaign. Some of that is the media anticipation. Some of that is the need to fundraise, okay? But there are criticisms of this way of doing it, okay? First of all, disproportionate attention goes to the early contests. We've talked about that, right? The more that you stretch it out and the more that you make it front-loaded, and the more importance that the media, but then also voters kind of following that, put on those early contests, the more that, again, you might have people even dropping out because they don't poll very well in Iowa ahead of time, not even waiting until the actual Iowa caucus to see what they do, but they just don't do well at all, okay? And they just drop out before it even starts. So that too much attention on the early contests. Obviously, most voters in most states then don't have a chance to vote at all on the nominee. Okay. Another criticism: important politicians can't devote the time to such a long campaign. Okay. People who already have positions, senators, governors, really have pretty important, busy, full-time jobs. They don't necessarily have time to go travel, flying to Iowa every weekend to try to campaign. And if you look at recently who have been some of the successful, but also some of the talked about people running, the successful people, Donald Trump, not a politician, never an office holder, didn't have any of that responsibility at the time that he ran. Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State and Senator. Joe Biden, former vice president. Mitt Romney, former governor. They weren't even in office when they were running. Some of the, Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida. So sometimes it's people who are already retired, but people who are already in office, it makes it hard. They miss votes in Congress. They can't do their job as well. So that's another issue. It makes it harder for them to run then, or for them to do their important jobs if they do decide to run and have to devote all that time to that long of a campaign, okay? Money becomes too important, okay? Part of that is the way that people focus and, for lack of a better word, the hype around that. But obviously, the longer the campaign, the more money it's going to take. That being said, you can always, the more that you let people spend unlimited amounts of money on these elections, the more that they will spend more and more and more, even if the election was only a month, right? They can always buy more advertising. They can always do more of that. But the longer the primary cycle, the more likely you are to have people who are, have to rely on money. Money becomes more important. Fundraising becomes more important. The influence of the big donors becomes, obviously, it's going to become more important. Another issue, and this is really with the primary system generally, primary participation is low, okay? There's only about 20% turnout in primaries, and again, only about 5% turnout in caucuses, okay? Not Iowa. Iowa is the first. It gets a lot of attention. People in Iowa know about this. They take it very seriously. Even so, it's more like a 20% turnout, okay? Eligible voters, only about 20% are coming out, okay? In part because people are not that committed to politics. People who might even vote in the general election do not feel engaged enough or invested enough in who wins the primary to come out and vote for whatever reason. They may just not care that much. They may not follow politics that closely. They may identify with one party or the other, but not really worry about who the nominee is, okay? So primary participation, voter participation in the primaries, the turnout rate is low, and the voters themselves are very unrepresentative. So only 20% of the people are voting in primaries. Who are these 20%? Well, they tend to be very committed, very much more partisan or ideological people who follow that stuff closely and who have very strong opinions about this candidate versus that candidate, right? So the primary turnout tends to be unrepresentative. That's why often when they're talking about, again, especially we're looking at the presidential elections and primaries here, they often talk about pivoting in the general election, meaning that the candidate was saying one thing to the primary voters who were much more ideological and felt much more strongly about a particular issue and wanted a more uncompromising stance on it, and then they pivot to the general voter who often has less strong opinions about these things and may want a more moderate, more centrist, purists might say more watered down, but they want something different than what the primary voters want. The primary voters want to hear a clear, uncompromising statement on immigration or free trade or abortion or whatever it is. General election voters don't necessarily want to hear that same thing, and definitely not that same uncompromising statement. So the candidate pivots from the primary voters to the general election voters, hoping that those primary voters who notice the pivot and who notice that they're not making such strong statements anymore, understand that, okay, now they're trying to win a general election. And even if they're now speaking in a kind of more moderate or watered down or circumspect way about these things, the primary voters will still prefer that candidate to the other candidate in the general election. So even if they now seem to be much more willing to compromise on these issues, the compromised version of their own party's candidate is much better than the other party's candidate, okay? But the issue is you can have unrepresentative primary turnout really deciding who ends up being the nominee and kind of shaping and driving that nomination process, and so the whole election in very fundamental ways, okay? Again, this is more of an issue with the primaries generally rather than the early primaries, okay? Final criticism, it gives too much power to the media. The media loves to talk about the horse race elements of it. That's part of why Iowa and New Hampshire are such a big deal, because they love to play up the drama of all of that. As we talked about when we talked about the media and politics, that need for profit, the way that almost everything has evolved into using the news to make a profit, either through necessity or because that was the plan and the business model all along. But these long primaries, especially with the strong emphasis on the early contests, gives a lot of power to the media. And again, the way that the media talks about it, they don't necessarily talk about the important substantive policy differences among candidates. They talk about personality, they talk about who's going to win, who's a dark horse, who has an outside chance, does this person really dislike this other person? Again, because they're trying to appeal to kind of a lowest common denominator, uninformed person who wants this to be entertaining rather than to really learn about policy and government. They tend to play up the wrong aspects of it. And again, this is not necessarily just the long primary cycle that does this. It's kind of a more fundamental issue with the media and its way of reporting on politics, especially now. Possible solutions: a national primary where everybody votes at once, or maybe regional primaries to lessen some of the traveling and some of the expenses to that. Those are good ideas. Those are alternatives or reforms that have been suggested, but it would take pretty significant changes to a lot of state laws, and it would take a general agreement by both, well, not by both. I mean, one party could switch to this, the other could keep it the way that it is, although generally state election laws just apply to everybody. So it would be more complicated for parties to have radically different primary systems like that. But one way or the other, national primary, regional primaries, these have been suggested as reforms or possible ways to ameliorate some of this, but there is very little chance of this happening. A lot of things would have to change. The states that have the early contests and therefore feel and are important would fight it definitely. So although these are maybe good ideas and these are suggestions, they are probably pretty unlikely to happen.